How to be more attractive mentally. Back in college, I was lonely and single. Every other guy seemed to be dating, getting girlfriends, and pretty much getting laid like crazy, whereas I felt functionally invisible to women. Now, as soul-crushing as this was, it did present me with a pretty good opportunity. From the sidelines, I could watch and observe, and I could learn which guys the women were the most attracted to, and most importantly, why. And the guy who consistently had women chasing him was my friend Dan. Honestly, it's nuts. Women would actually go crazy for this guy. They would fight over him. Whenever we would bring Dan up in conversation, a lot of women, their eyes would sort of like change, their body language would change, like, oh, that guy, you know? It was really bizarre to watch. Now, the mental image in your head right now of Dan is probably someone who's about 6'3", an Adonis-like figure with a strong jawline, tall, dark and handsome, that kind of thing, right? But this couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, Dan wasn't tall, he was actually quite short. He didn't have a strong jawline, he wasn't conventionally attractive in any metric. You'd look at him and think, well, okay, well, you know, this guy, why does this guy get so many women? He even looked, honestly, a lot like Robin Williams. And I couldn't wrap my head around it. I couldn't figure it out. So I started studying Dan to try to figure out what it was that made women so attracted to him. And after a while, I figured out what it was. So here are the three main things that made Dan so attractive to women. And luckily, these three things are things that we can emulate ourselves. The first thing, he wasn't ashamed of himself. Let me ask you a question. If you had a micro penis, like very, very small, what would you do about it? Would you want people to know about it? Well, if you're anything like me and most men, you'd probably want to keep that thing to yourself, right? Keep that detail to yourself. But the thing is about Dan, he wasn't like most people. In addition to the other stuff I mentioned earlier that made him conventionally unattractive, he also had a micro penis. And to make matters worse, he got pantsed, kegged, like pulled down, one time in high school, and since then, everyone knew about it. Now, this would be social death to most people, wouldn't it? Definitely you or me. But the thing is, Dan isn't like most people. So he kind of spun it and started wearing this like a badge of honor. He would often be the very first person to mention it to a group of people. He had a bunch of jokes that he made at his own expense that made him laugh, that made everyone else laugh about it. And a couple of times he actually showed people who were curious about it. Now, I wouldn't advise that, but it just goes to show that he handled it in a completely different way than most people would. And pretty soon, nobody could use it against him. And what's even more crazy is he had, through doing this, accidentally become the most confident man in high school and college. And women were all over him. It was kind of genius, really. Lesson number 2, he had a strong reality. One morning at 6 AM, I climbed on the college bus to go to college, obviously. And I climbed up to the top of the deck and I saw Dan sat at the back seat. That's where he always was sat. And on this particular day, he was sat there at the back, and I remember it forever, I think. And he was surrounded by people. He was like a king holding court. Everyone was kind of listening to what he had to say, and they all seemed very, very engaged. And I thought to myself, what the hell is it he's talking about that gets everybody so captivated? And after about 30 seconds, I learned what it was, and I couldn't believe it. I overheard Dan say, yeah, so T41B power armor, it's the best kind of armor in the game, but you can only get it later on in the game. You don't get it at the start. This guy, he was captivating an audience of beautiful women by talking about Fallout 3. And I couldn't figure out how the hell he could do that, because some of the people in the group, including the beautiful girls, they didn't give a crap about video games. They didn't care about that. But somehow they were interested when Dan was talking about it. Why was that? Well, the answer to that is quite easy. It's quite simple. His reality was strong as fuck. He knew what he liked, he knew what he enjoyed doing, he knew his interests, he knew what fascinated him, and he didn't care at all if people didn't approve of him. It wasn't and it isn't about the specifics of what he's talking about. It's more about how unapologetic and strong he is. And this is actually the secret of pretty much every influential person in history. The person with the strongest reality is often the most attractive person in the room. And lesson 3, he wasn't afraid to feel things. Most men are afraid of feeling things, especially in the company of other people. This is one of the things I noticed in college. Most men seemed to look uncomfortable and stiff all the time. Their voice was often suppressed and quiet like a mouse and really high-pitched. They often would pull awkward facial expressions that made it look like they were trying to stifle emotion or trying to control themselves in some way. It looked very strange. They even moved in weird ways with really weird sort of posture. And it sounds really mean to say this, but the whole kind of vibe, as I thought it at the time, kind of embodied just cringe. And unsurprisingly, these were often the guys that women would avoid like the plague. And at this point, you can probably guess that Dan did the exact opposite. If he found something funny, he would laugh his ass off about it. If you asked him how he was, he wouldn't just say, "Oh, I'm fine, thanks." He would say something like, "Oh, I'm pretty nervous about this exam later." Like, you really knew where you stood, and he was really expressive about how he felt. There was no kind of like trying to control it. And I think it's this authenticity that made women very, very safe around it. And it's this safety that is very, very attractive to women. Now, the things that usually make a man super cringe, this stuff is not like intentional. It comes from unprocessed wounds, unprocessed emotional baggage from the past, and in some way you could say trauma. But the best method I've ever found for overcoming that is shadow work. If you've not heard about it, don't worry about it, because I go into it in other parts of my channel. But if you're interested in processing this, if you resonated with that part of this, then click this video next, because in this video I'm going to give you 5 of the best sort of self-reflection questions you can ask yourself in order to heal yourself. And if you need personal help, check out my one-to-one mentorship program on my website. This is going to help you build deep and lasting self-confidence from within, no fake bullshit. So that was it. I appreciate you, mate, and I'll see you next week. Peace.